Welcome to our conversation today, The Look Ahead, Teacher and Student Mental Health. My name is Adriana Karka, and I'm the training manager of Sonderly. We are a learning platform for educators and other professionals who are looking to access education and training on autism and mental health. Today, we're honored to have Dr. Chris Jenson. Now that the school year is finished, educators are taking a pause, Dr. Jenson, and they're reflecting on the past year. They're thinking probably about the highlights of the year, but also about some of the challenges and some of the red flags they might have missed. Another reason why it's so great to have you here today is because educators also might be thinking about their mental health, about what could have done this past year to take better care of themselves, and also how to help manage stress.
Absolutely. I think you said that so well, and that's at the top of everyone's mind as they try to relax over summer. What happened and what's next. And so it's an honor to be here. I'm a huge fan of Sonderly and the outreach and education you provide, and I'm thrilled to have this conversation today. So thank you for inviting me.
Oh, thank you. So I'm going to introduce you now to everyone. So Dr. Jenson has collaborated with Sonderly in the past, as we know. We are at Sonderly trying to draw a roadmap that will help educators ensure that their time in the classroom is the best it can be, to deter burnout, and also looking at moving out of this pandemic time that we're in and what we can do in the future. So all of these themes we'll talk about with you today, Dr. Jenson. You serve as a senior health advisor for multiple school districts across the United States and Canada, also for businesses. And you have been doing a lot of work creating evidence-based improvements to help boost mental health, not just for students, but also for staff. And so Dr. Jenson began his journey at the University of Notre Dame. He moved on to the Loyola University School of Medicine and completed a 4-year rotation with the Northwestern Emergency Medicine residency program. And after working in emergency departments and urgent care environments, you found a love and passion for education, leaving clinical medicine to focus on teaching and consulting. So you've got the two sides to what you bring to our conversation today. The collaborations that you've done with Sonderly already, we've been so excited about. So also you spent the last 5 years serving as a consultant for health challenges in education and business, offering data-driven solutions, and really, really passionate about not just being a healthcare provider, but improving the current situation for all school-aged students. So thank you so much for being here. And just for those watching live, I wanted to just let you know that we do have a chat screen on the side of the platform today. So any questions or comments that you have, please add them in. And at the end of our time together, we'll have a question and answer period. We'll dive right into the conversation, Dr. Jenson. And again, one of the reasons that we're here is because educators are reflecting back, looking at some of the challenges, some of the great times, but also some of the challenges they might have experienced this past year. And I wanted to first discuss what you can offer us in terms of describing these mental health challenges that educators can look for in the classroom. What signs, what red flags should people be looking for?
Sure, that is a fantastic question, and I just want to segue into, this is a great opportunity and a great conversation that needs to be had, because we're going to talk about student mental health, but as you alluded to, we're going to talk about staff mental health too,
Mhm.
and we'll quickly find, to no surprise, that the job intertwines the two, right?
Right.
Not just operationally, but also emotionally. But to start with kids are our focus. Anyone in
Mhm.
education realizes the incredible value of kids. And mental health strain for children, I hate to say it, is going to typically look different for every kid.
Right.
Even in a specific grade level, kids differ chronologically by age, maturity level, their ability to process information and regulate the emotion associated with that information.
Mhm.
So there's a wide degree of normal. And and I want to say that up front because I want to take some weight off the shoulders of teachers. We are not looking for educators to make a diagnosis. They are not a qualified healthcare provider. During my career, one of the proud chapters of my life was being a high school science teacher. I was in the thick of it, just like every other educator. Yes, I had that medical side to my perspective, but I saw the value of teachers, how skillful they are, how adept they are, but as amazing as they are, and as diverse as their skill set is, they're not healthcare providers. So what can teachers do, right? I mean,
Mhm.
how can we better ourselves to recognize issues with children and also put ourselves in a better position to help those kids in a way that's within our skill set? And I think the answer is the middle ground,
Right.
recognizing red flags. So yes, there's a wide degree of normal for each child, but there are some predictable trends that we should be aware of, both for the elementary school age children as well as secondary age. And so I think learning those trends is a reasonable thing that an educator can do if they want to be helpful. So let's talk about a few.
Sure.
We know that elementary school, let's start with that. Let's just start with our
Mhm.
littles, right? Elementary school is such a pivotal time for as we shape the architecture of the human brain, the foundations for sound mental health. It's also an area we need to be focusing on more. The news media headlines in North America often discuss adolescent mental health, and they should. There's a lot of things going on that we need to
Mhm.
be aware of. But we know that about half of mental health disparities start before the age of 14. That's when we diagnose them. They're there well before then. So elementary is a great time for intervention. So what are some trends you can know? Well, the developing child at Harvard University, which is a department
Mhm.
that they run or a division they run, does a really nice job kind of laying it out for the non-healthcare provider. And they talk about the most common ones in the elementary school setting are going to be anxiety, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder or ADHD, conduct disorder, and if we were going to name a fourth, it would be depression, right?
Okay.
Now, with really young kids, K through 6, these don't manifest in the same way that they do with older students, or often they don't, I should say. So let's go through them one at a time, right?
Okay.
What would anxiety look like in general in the
Mm.
elementary setting?
That's right.
Well, you got to remember that your youngest kiddos might have a hard time articulating their anxiety because they're overwhelmed with these emotional feelings or physical ailments, right? Like headache, nausea, vomiting. And to tether them to a thought, all this occurred because of a thought that I had or a concern that I had is asking a lot of a 5, 6, 7-year-old student.
That's
And
true.
so what teachers might see is a change, an unexpected change that's predictable in the emotional realm as well as the physical realm. So in the emotional realm, it might be what I think most people would categorize as an outburst, crying out of nowhere,
I've
angry out
seen,
of
yeah.
nowhere.
We've seen those, yeah.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, with my own children,
Mhm.
we get our fair share, right? With my own golden retriever,
Mhm.
and I don't mean to make light of the situation, but you can get these unexpected behavioral changes,
Right.
or I think tantrum is a bad word. It's more just a crying, anger, emotional release out of nowhere,
Sure.
or it can be just physical symptoms that arose quickly that don't seem to have a precise cause. This wasn't a kid who's been sick the last couple of days, but suddenly they have a headache or they're nauseous or they threw up in the middle of class. And that's really kind of predictable from a science nerd perspective because when we are very anxious, we trigger our fight or flight response, which
Absolutely.
often releases adrenaline. And if you've ever been your most nervous, any adult knows you feel like you're going to puke, your heart's pounding, your head may be ailing you, and so little kids often experience anxiety that way.
And
And
they
so,
can't express it.
correct. It's impressive when they can. I would say most of the time in my clinical practice, when I was worried about anxiety in a K through 6 student,
Mhm.
it was more a discussion about feelings and how have your
Sure.
feelings changed over the last couple of weeks, and as opposed to, well, what are your worries? What are your concerns? That's a little more of an adult brain type discussion.
Makes sense, yeah.
So yeah, and so what I would say as a teacher is if you see some of those emotional or physical symptoms seemingly arising rather abruptly and then remaining over a duration of time,
Mhm.
that might be a red flag to contact a parent or contact the appropriate person in your school, whether it be a counselor, a psychologist, if you're fortunate enough to have one, maybe even a social worker to say, I'm not a diagnostician, but I've noticed these changes, and I'm curious if this might be anxiety. Again, not to make a diagnosis, just to raise a flag. So let's go through the other ones in elementary.
Sure.
ADHD. There's a group that I really like called Child Mind Institute, based out of the United States, that does a
Child mind.
wonderful job talking. Yeah, they're really
Yeah, I've
good.
heard of them. Yeah, of course. Yeah.
And they do a nice job talking about some common mental health strain in little kids. And so for ADHD, many parents are very familiar with it. But for those that are not, or educators that wonder what is ADHD versus a kid who's just kind of wound up.
Mm.
And what you typically see in kids is manifestations of like fidgeting, difficulty maintaining attention. It might be something along the lines of organizational changes, like losing homework or daydreaming a lot, or kind of like a loss of situational awareness. Was their response or focus appropriate for the situation? But I feel like that could be any of my two daughters any given day. And so what really defines that is you're looking for that to occur in multiple settings. A kid could be stressed. It's their first couple days of fourth grade, or something occurred outside of school, and now they're manifesting these symptoms in school. And so you're looking for this to be a pervasive set of symptoms in at least two different settings. Home and school are the best to study, because that's where kids are most. And then it's got to be there for at least 6 months,
Okay.
which is seemingly quite a long amount of time. But I think that's good. We don't want to jump to that diagnosis. For example, some kids start at a grade level and they're rather young, and their maturity is going to naturally be lagging behind other students, and they're perfectly fine developing right on schedule. But just because of their chronological age and early entrance into a grade, they might seem more distracted or have a harder time focus. And so, so this is another potential red flag that teachers can raise. Hey, I've had this student, I adore this student, but I've noticed it since September, and it's now January, and it seems to be more days than not. That's another opportunity to not make a diagnosis, but just to say, should we look into this further? And
Would
who you're
you
saying that to, again,
would you suggest
please.
taking notes? Would you suggest having
Yeah,
conversations in the with a school psychologist, with any of those? How how
sure.
how can we take those notes, but then also use them and take them to the right people in our school systems, for example?
Great question. So the
Mhm.
right people is going to vary district by district,
Right.
depending on the resources and assets of the district. But typically, counselors, social workers, school psychologists
Mhm.
are your best go-to folks. Notes, fantastic idea.
Mhm.
I remember, even though I had a medical background, when I was in a classroom, that was not my job. My job was to teach, and so I
Sure.
acted like a teacher. And I would simply write down the date and a specific example, and I had a password protected Word file,
Sure.
just to respect the child's privacy.
Of course.
And I never put the name.
Mhm.
I'd give the kid a nickname. And so, and I had those specific notes. So when I went to the counselor, I could give them very detailed information of, here's just, I didn't write down every day, but here's once a week something I saw, for a couple months. And I'm thinking maybe we talk to the parents about investigating this. And then
Great.
you turn it over to that individual who's qualified to do that
Mhm.
job, and you let them do their thing. And, I think one of the things as a teacher you have to remember is if you're wrong, that's fine. You're still taking care of a kid. You know, you saw something, you wanted to investigate it,
Mhm.
you did the honorable thing. You're not there to make a diagnosis. So don't make it personal if it ends up being that or not being that. Your job is just to be a caring adult, in the
Great.
midst of all the other things that we do. Um, Third one that Harvard mentioned was conduct disorders.
Okay.
And sometimes those are a little more self-apparent.
Mhm.
There's a wide bandwidth of conduct disorders, but I think the most recognized one that a teacher might view would be something similar to antisocial, where Johns Hopkins does a nice job describing it
Mhm.
through their school of medicine. They talk about how it would look in a classroom, and they cite, being irresponsible, seemingly deliberately, or maybe not, but it's a consistent
Okay.
irresponsibility. Skipping expectations that other children would perceive as fun and enjoyable. or skipping school altogether.
Okay.
Um, Maybe even if it's a more severe form, what looks like a persistent disregard of other students' feelings. Kids are figuring out relationships and
Mhm.
friendships, and that's a tenuous process that there's no manual for. And they're going to fail. They're going to screw up sometimes. They're going to say things they
Mhm.
shouldn't have, and they're going to forget other kids' emotions. But if it becomes a trend, that's something to
Sure.
consider. So, so to recap, because I was like drinking from a fire hose, I apologize.
No, no.
In the elementary setting, I think the key points are there are some common mental health strains. Probably the most common are anxiety, ADHD, conduct disorders. Not every kid is going to manifest them the same, but we can look for some of those red flags that I outlined, not to make a diagnosis, but rather to say, hey, I've taught for 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, and I'm seeing these red flags in this kid, and I'm going to go contact a counselor or a social worker. And then here's the hardest part as a teacher, because we're type A and we care, then I'm done. I did my part.
Right, you passed
You know,
on the information.
exactly. And I think teachers are so kind hearted and so giving of their time and effort that, yes, I think it's nice to have some follow up, but you may not get that for student privacy, or for other reasons. And just know you did a great job. Take it off your plate, take it off your mind.
Great.
So I would I would say that's the elementary side of things. Do you want to dive into secondary?
So I was just one of the just to go back to conduct disorder, which absolutely teachers are seeing some of those red flags. You mentioned being irresponsible or seeing those behaviors or those trends of being irresponsible. Did you want to give an example for that, just so that we have some ideas for when we're thinking about our own students and the classroom that itself?
Sure, sure. Um, you know, keep in mind we all define irresponsible as a different way, but I think
True.
in this context, it's irresponsible against widely accepted social norms,
Okay.
not your personal values as a teacher, widely accepted social norms.
Hmm.
And so, could you, for example, well, let me back up a second. A kid who doesn't turn their homework in on time, that could be many reasons. I think what we're more talking about is I'm going to say please and thank you and be respectful to my classmates and teacher.
Okay.
And maybe this is a simple manifestation of kids will forget that, right? But what if it becomes they never do that,
Okay.
or they almost never do that? What if it grows into kids struggle with sharing, right? That's normal, that's expected, it
Mhm.
develops over elementary school. But what if you're consistently seeing a child hold a toy or an item of interest in a leveraging manner, almost of having power
Mm.
over other children, that might be irresponsible. It's not just struggling with sharing, it's leveraging a situation to influence power over others. And again, these examples, what you're really looking for is repetitive examples over time,
Right.
um,
Okay.
on any on any given day, on my worst days before coffee. I'm sure I display, not to make light of it. I'm sure I'm not the perfect human being that I would like to be, or nowhere close to it. But it's when we're seeing consistency against widely accepted social norms, that we might raise a red flag and say, hey, should we look into this with this kiddo?
Great. Yeah. And then I'm really glad that you were talking about that consistency and that pattern over time. And you were saying, up to 6 months of seeing similar red flags. So, educators can actually think about, am I seeing that for a long period of time? And that's when I start to think, okay, there's got to be something more to take notes about here. Great.
Sure. And going back to your suggestion of taking notes in the journal,
Mhm.
um, it's also an excellent idea because keep in mind, you can have a bad week as an educator,
Or you can forget, yeah, what,
right?
or not be,
And so
be distracted with things, yeah.
absolutely, what is the actual frequency of this kid
Mhm.
displaying these behavioral patterns as I average them over time?
Okay.
Was September a bad month? And then maybe later in parent teacher conferences, you find out there was a loss of a family member.
Mm.
It's you got to give kids some gratitude and some leeway. But when it becomes persistent for a long duration, I think it's appropriate at that point for a teacher to say, I love this kid, I'm concerned about this kid. I would like to hand this over to a professional where this is their job.
Great.
So, and then, like we said, let it go because there's already enough things on teachers' plates. Um, okay, shall we move on to high school?
Sure. I know
Okay,
we have quite a few secondary educators who are looking for those answers as well.
sure. Secondary school, obviously, just as important as elementary, but things start to look a little different. So, first of all, you know, kids have always developed over time and had mental health strain, but are things really as challenging as they say they are? And forgive me to dive into some science and math, and we'll come back to the holistic side in a moment. But sadly, yeah, and I'm probably preaching to the choir in our audience, so to
Mm,
speak, who are adept educators that are aware of what's going on in schools. But should you need justification to address and be invested in this problem, the American CDC pre-pandemic found that in the United States between 2009 and 2019, the prevalence of depression in adolescents went up 40%. I've seen numbers from Canada that are similar.
similar, yes.
The American Academy of Pediatrics would tell you that in the U.S., before graduation, 1 out of 3 kids would meet some level of a associated anxiety disorder, whether it be social anxiety, generalized anxiety, whatever, what have you. And then not long ago, I believe it was the end of March 2022, the CDC had a follow up that confirmed the pandemic made things worse.
Right.
And 44% of those students surveyed felt persistent sadness or hopelessness. And sadly, 18 to 20% considered suicidal ideations. And there's more and more data that I can pull. There were studies in Ontario that the rates of depression were very similar to what the CDC found in the United States in adolescents. And so, obviously, that's something near and dear to our heart.
It is.
And I want to just put the caveat, if I may,
Mm-hmm.
it is probably not realistic, or certainly not an expectation for a teacher to solve these problems. And I think a lot of times we put that burden on ourselves again because we care. Elementary school teachers want to be all things to the kids they have. It's like a second
Mm-hmm.
family to them. So do secondary teachers. Sometimes in secondary teachers, the stakes may seem higher. There's more concern for suicidal ideation in teens as opposed to 5 through 10. But what we
And
see,
that feeling of wanting to prepare them for leaving school and getting out into the real world.
absolutely, in a weird way, and I'll pick on myself. I
Mhm.
felt that pressure. You know, I've got this much time to get you ready for the real world, and so I completely agree. So,
Mhm.
so let's go back, and if we look at what's prevalent in secondary school, a lot of it
Sure.
overlaps. To no surprise,
Mhm.
anxiety, depression, suicide ideations, and now throw in substance abuse.
Okay.
Um, so I'm going to try and be more concise with their time, but anxiety in the adolescent population is actually often a little more straightforward to figure out. And a student may be able to communicate their thoughts more to, I am feeling this way because of this concern, or this thought drove me to experience nausea, headache, and sweats. Um, the question is, will they share it? Right.
Sure.
And so if they don't, but you suspect it, you might see other things that confirm it, such as kind of avoidance behavior of the things that are causing anxiety. So skipping tests, missing out on meets, kids great in practice, but doesn't want to be there for the track meet. You might see avoidance of performance-based activities. I love the theater, and that kid loves the theater, but I'm not going to try out for the spring musical. Why? That's their love, that's your passion. And so there might be something keeping them from doing that. And so if a kid is forthcoming about the anxiety, great. We can fast track them to help. But you may not see that. You may see what looks like avoidance behaviors. And we can get tricked. Kids are great at giving excuses as to why they didn't show up for something. And I think we got to give them the benefit of the doubt. And when it becomes a pattern again, that discussion of could this be anxiety? Depression, kids are phenomenal at, as they say, fake it till you make it.
Okay.
There's still a stigma around mental health, and a lot of kids don't want to be seen, especially in adolescence, as different in any way. Yet, do they realize that many of their classmates are struggling with, depressive symptoms as well? So, I think one of the best things staff can look for is change in grades, change in friend groups,
Mhm.
change in sleep. Now all of a sudden they're tired in your class, change in attitudes. You're looking for change. That kid may walk in with a smile on their face and look like everything's fine.
Mm.
But if everything's fine, you shouldn't see those changes in all those areas at once. And so I think you're looking for a constellation of changes. Again,
Okay.
not to nail this too much, but not to make a diagnosis, just to get to the right counselor, social worker, school psych. And then suicide has really become tricky.
Mm.
Um, if every kid displayed what the DSM-5 tries to outline for suicide and made it straightforward, we would catch a lot of more adolescent suicide attempts, but they don't. And so often it's almost passive, litmus test to see where their self-worth is compared to others. So it might be the phenomenon of vague booking, putting
Mm.
these statements on social media about, I don't really think anyone cares about me, or this happened today, but no one's going to care. And it's almost like a test to see what's the response from their friend groups and crowd. Do people notice them? Do they care? Do they feel empathetic to the situation they're in? Or did they get 12 likes and to them that's devastating?
Okay.
And so while staff can't monitor social media accounts,
Mhm.
um, looking for subtle things in class, like a kid assigning excessive blame to themselves, might reflect feelings of worthlessness, right?
Right.
A kid suddenly saying, this is not possible, not because of their academic skills or abilities, but just because they believe things are not possible. It's those subtle, almost under your breath statements that you're not expected to make a diagnosis. But the key that I would say here is, if you actually have concerns about a kid being suicidal to some extent or contemplating suicide, I think that's one time where you refer early.
Okay.
Whereas ADHD, anxiety, depression are very important and very significant, but you've got time. The seemingly odd statement under your breath, where the kid might be wondering if you notice,
Mm.
is the time where I think, if it strikes you odd in the heart and mind, you follow up that day. You know,
And Dr.
and
Jensen, would you say that this is happening in elementary school as well? Are elementary educators to look for those signs as well?
Sadly, there was a statistic that came out right around the time, I think forgive me, I'm going to falter on the exact date, but
Mhm.
sometime between 2015 and 2019. I know it was pre-pandemic. But in the US, the fastest growing group of suicide attempts was 10 to 14 females, 10 to
Okay.
14-year-old females, which would be fifth grade, sixth grade into junior high. So, yes.
Okay.
And so I think that, sadly, um, you take those statements or those innuendos serious until proven otherwise.
Okay.
Where I always almost tell teachers to put the brakes on with some of the other things, like, hey, let's track it over time and see if it's a bad month or really a pervasive issue. This is one where I would tell teachers, you know, if your gut tells you there's something, do it that day.
Okay.
There's nothing wrong with a counselor coming back to you and saying, we had a nice talk, they're good. You're going to
That's
sleep better
wonderful.
that night, and if your gut was right, you may have just done the most important thing in your teaching career. So while it is not our job, it is a very wonderful asset that we can provide if we notice these cryptic, subtle statements or actions.
Okay.
And I would generally say, any time a kid is testing their self-worth and looking for a response, that to me is a red flag.
Okay. Thank you for that.
So, sure, absolutely. And the last thing I would just say before we move on, because we got some other great questions,
Mhm.
you can tell I'm overly passionate about this topic, but the last thing I would say is sadly, substance abuse waxes and wanes,
Okay.
with adolescence, and it seems to be a little bit up again. And substance abuse reminder is, yes, there are going to be some teens that engage in alcohol and other illicit drugs for various reasons, but often one of the most common reasons that we forget about is escapism.
Okay.
There is something difficult going on in their life, with their parents, with their family, with school, that they just need to go to a different place, and alcohol and drugs allow them to do that. And so, how do you look for that? Probably the same way you do for depression:
Okay.
changes. A kid may look like they have it all together during class, but if they're changing in multiple areas despite the smile on their face, hey,
Mhm.
what's going on? Let's look into this.
Okay. So those are a lot of things that educators can think about. I'm really glad that you talked about looking for these changes, but also the duration of these changes being several months long. Also thinking about when to speak to a counselor. There's times when we do need to get to one of the school professionals faster. Other times when we can keep track, look for patterns, and I'm glad you were saying, but then continue doing your role as a teacher, as an educator, and you've seen what you need to see and you've passed it on. So thank you for addressing those things. And speaking about just a few minutes ago, you mentioned how it has been harder during the pandemic. It's been difficult on educators for a variety of reasons, and we are slowly emerging. Things are changing in Canada and the United States, but what can, as we get back into the new school year, August, September of this coming year, what can educators do to help their students with this?
Sure. So interestingly, small segue, I apologize, but had a chance to work on and be a part of basically a research study that looked at implementations in student health. And why I bring this up
Mhm.
is we were working with schools both in the US and Canada and dealing with teachers on the front lines. It was 38 schools, more than 700 kids. Not going to talk about the study, but what I want to say is the most common thread from those 38 schools, both
Mhm.
US and Canada, was, Chris, 2021, 2022 felt harder,
Okay.
felt more difficult.
Yeah, we heard
Um,
similar.
and
We heard similar messaging on our in
uh,
from our school systems. Yeah.
yeah, oh my gosh. And, it really did not surprise me. I think maybe in 2020, as this was all unfolding, you're so focused on, okay, can we get things in a better state so we feel closer to normal? And that's your driving focus. But all of a sudden, I think we transitioned, and this is a little bit more opinion, but I've
Mhm.
heard this opinion repetitively from educators, and I agree with it. And that is, we told kids and parents and administrators and teachers during 2020, it's okay to not be okay. This is a very difficult situation for the entire world,
Mhm.
and people are polarized and they have thoughts and opinions, and it's tough to navigate. And this is hard. And basically, the message came through to both teachers and students: this is hard. You're not going to feel good for a while. Talk to us, share with us. How can we support you? So, kids walk in 2021, as do teachers. And I don't think it was misguided in a sense of wanting to cause problems, but it was just trying to be upbeat. Hey, we got a new year. Let's go after it. Things are better. Let's roll
Yeah.
into it. And
Starting
a lot of
fresh.
these kids, exactly. And that's your heart's in the right place. But for a lot of kids and teachers, they weren't there. They were not ready for that yet. And probably because a lot of this burden was not shared equally. The pandemic presented challenges to all folks in all
Mhm.
nations. But let's be honest, that was not an equal distribution. And some cohorts of adults and kids experienced a much rougher pandemic, not just physiologically, but also emotionally, economically. And so I think what I would do is build on those realities and say,
Okay.
I think even next year, we're not far enough out yet for everyone to be okay. And I think you walk in, and one of the most powerful things that a teacher can do once they've connected with kids is to be authentic, right? Because they trust you at that point. And they're,
Mhm.
for as squirrely and as at times they may drive us crazy, they generally adore their teachers, right? Some don't, many do. And if you're playing the law of averages, we meet kids where they are at that point once we've earned their trust. And I think some specific ways to do that is, if the problem is that some of the kids in your room still feel awkward and isolated,
Sure.
make it painfully obvious that your classroom is a place where all is welcome. And I'm not joking. Like, we forget at the high school and junior high level in the US at least
Mhm.
to reemphasize that. A lot of times in elementary schools, hey, I'm so glad you're here. Sit down with us at circle
Right.
time. High school kids love that too. When a kid walked in late, did I give him a tardy? Sure. But the first
Mhm.
thing I gave them was, I'm glad you made it to class today. I'm glad you're here.
Those comments
You
go
know,
so far.
they do. the little things. And, maybe in my mind, I'm thinking, I'm not surprised you're late. But what I want to communicate to a kid is, I'm glad you're here. So
Mhm.
make it, you have your style. Every teacher does.
Yeah.
Find a way to remind kids nearly every day, if not every day, I'm glad you're here. Because sadly, for some kids, you may be the only person that says that day,
Yeah.
right? And be the person that adds value. Second thing is, if some of your kids are lagging social skills because they did have some time off in isolation, and
Sure.
depending on their growth and development, that could have been at a particularly pivotal time. Never a better year to build in more group activities where you're working on relationships, even if you have to trim some of the academics. You know, maybe some of your grade comes from how did you decide who was going to do what job? How did you divide up the tasks? How did you support each other? What's your plan for when someone struggles, whether that's a good reason or not a bad reason? How will the group help them? Just like building out these activities and scaling it to develop some of their relationship skills is a part of school. You just get to choose it, how much do you want to accentuate that in your classroom, right? And I'll pick on myself. I would assign
Mhm.
group activities and projects, and I laid them out on paper, and I thought they were great. I was all excited, and you know what I forgot? The most important part: how are you going to set yourselves up in a group for success? Who's good at what? Who's bad at what? How do we maximize your group strengths? I should have been teaching that more. And it's not just the academic side of it; it's the who's got what going on this week. How
Right.
much time can you give? And just dealing with the realities of life. And that may give a kid an opportunity who maybe, is in turmoil for some reason they don't want to admit. But now you give them a segue to say, oh, well, I have to help my family with X, Y, Z, and da da da. The pressure rolls off, and they figure out a way to compensate for this group project. Now, if a kid does that all the time, you're going to have a conversation. But if a kid does that once, maybe you gave them the opportunity to find some calm, you know.
And you're hearing them. You're hearing them that, this might be a more difficult week for me than it was last week, and you're hearing them. That's a great.
Absolutely, absolutely. And then if you want something that's data driven, I confess I'm a data driven nerd. American Academy of Pediatrics has a mnemonic called HELP. It actually has more than the four letters I'm going to give you, but I'm just going to give you the
Mhm.
top four that I think translate to the classroom. When you talk to kids, right, be authentic, and you can talk about problems. You
Mhm.
can admit realities that are going on in your community and whatnot, as long
Yeah.
as you do it in a professional, appropriate way. But there should always be hope in your voice, right? This stinks. It's tough. It may even be bad for a while. But you know what, friends? I see a light at the end of the tunnel, and here's why.
So modeling that, great.
Modeling hope and make it realistic.
Mhm.
Don't make it,
Real, make
you
it real.
know, don't just
Mhm.
hang it out there on an emotional whim that's a nice quote. Here's
Mhm.
why. Here's why I think things will get better.
Okay.
Kids need to hear that. Empathy. Um, I always struggle to try and find solutions for patients and students until an oncology patient one day literally looked me in the eye in the ER and said, I appreciate what you're doing. I just want you to listen. And it was the first time in my life I really just got quiet,
Mhm.
right? Kids, if they feel like they have someone that gets them, I think most teachers know that is half the battle. Even if you look at a kid in their eye, I mean, let's not placate them, especially if they're older students who know the realities of life. Even if you look at a kid in the eye and say, I'm not sure I can fix this for you fast, or this is going to take time to address, but I am always willing to talk. And let's connect you to this person and that person, and let's outline a map so you see some solutions. And
Mhm.
while you're fighting the good fight, bud, I'm here to listen. There will always be at least one person in your life that gets it. So that's empathy, which we're all familiar with in education. Loyalty.
Okay.
Loyalty is you don't just have a nice talk and then the next week forget about the kid. It's the quietly in the hallway. Hey, how's that coming along? The kid don't know what you're talking about. How's this week compared to next week? They know what you're saying. It's the loyalty. It's the keep coming back, right? Mrs. Smith doesn't forget about me. Not only does Mrs. Smith say I can talk every time, but even when I'm not talking to Mrs. Smith, how's your week?
Checking
How are we
in.
doing? Yeah, checking in, loyalty. And the last thing is if the situation allows it, right? Because we can't do all things, but if the situation allows it, can you make a partnership and a plan with that kid? Hey, let's get you out of this hole. You're going to do the work, but I'll help you write the plan. And kids I think value that. So I think going back to your point, it's just
Mhm.
addressing the realities of, and a lot of kids in your class may be fine. But I think you just, hey, we are all at different points. This is true every year, no matter if there's a pandemic or not. But some of you, you know, may be at different spots than others. So here's how my class works. Everyone's welcome. I care about all of you. I expect this and this out of behavior. And then telling a kid, here's what you can expect out of me. You know, I listen, I follow
Yeah.
up, I help, I'm going to teach you how to do things yourselves, but I'm here to teach you. So I think that two-way relationship is a good way to go.
Yeah, I like that mnemonic of hope, empathy, loyalty, and partnership. That will be something that we can write down and we can think about, and also the authenticity. I'm so glad you talked about that as well. And
Well,
so
that's fair. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
no, I was just gonna say, and the fact that, we have ways to help educators. We can think of something that we can do, because we do know that, educators are reaching career exhaustion at alarming rates right now. The pandemic definitely added to that, and so one of the things that a lot of educators are asking about is how do we find the fun again? How do we find the joy? Do you have any thoughts about how to make a, an educator's job more joyful and bring that back into the classroom?
Absolutely. And this was one of the reasons I was excited to have this discussion with you today is
Mhm.
because while student mental health is critically important, I don't want to undercut that. Let's talk about
Mhm.
teachers.
Yeah.
They need it. And so, yeah, you hit the nail on the head. Staff are exhausted.
Mhm.
Attrition rates in many countries are way higher than they traditionally are at the end of the year. There's a certain ebb and flow to school life and retirement, and a lot of people are leaving. And according to the NEA, which is the teacher union in the United States,
Mhm.
51% of educators last year said, yeah, I'm going to leave early. They didn't specify when, but I will be leaving my career early. And so it's a burnout that we've never seen before in education. And I'm sad to say it's not surprising. And I
Mhm.
think here's why. Let me be definitive. When you think about caregivers, maybe the more traditional caregivers you think of, let's say nurses and physicians, right? Pharmacists, there are many caregivers. Let's talk about those in healthcare. What do? They provide a skill or service for someone who's vulnerable by putting that person first,
Mhm.
right? Addressing their emotional, physical, and physiologic needs and delivering care that they need because of their vulnerable position. Well, teachers do that too.
Absolutely.
You're dealing with children who are inherently in vulnerability. You provide a skill or a service that they need. It's not always academic, right? We just talked about some of the ways we can address their mental health. That's certainly not part of your science curriculum, but it's just the reality of teaching. And so caregivers are burnt out. We saw people in the healthcare environment experience this burnout. We see teachers experience this burnout. Now, I mention that because some of the initiatives that have been longstanding in healthcare, as well as new ones, translate well to school life. And so self care, which we often talk about, it's a great thing.
Mhm.
Hey, if you go home at the end of the night and you play your guitar or piano to unwind, good for you. If you like to
Sure.
run in the morning, wonderful. But what are you going to do about your 9 hours a day at school? And so when you really can't sit down and do yoga. So how can we maximize your job? Well, there's a couple different ways, right? Let's start out with some reality changes that you can implement in a school. The
Okay.
first is changing your mindset, triage.
Hmm.
Now, triage in medical terms is actually not the super exciting stuff we see on Grey's Anatomy. Triage in the medical world is workflow. So, workflow meaning that I cannot be all persons at all spots at all times for all kids in my classroom.
Mhm.
So, what has to get done? The interesting thing about it is triage has been so widely accepted in medicine that no one bats an eye or feels guilty when they utilize it. So let me give you an example. If I'm working an 8-hour shift in the ER and 4 devastating cases come in, and maybe I only see 6 patients that day, because 4 of them were the highest acuity you could imagine. Maybe they had to be resuscitated. Maybe they were gravely
Mhm.
ill. No one in the ER is going to criticize me when at the end of my shift, I walk out. Why? Because I handled what the universe gave me. No one says, Chris, could you run some photocopies for the medical students tomorrow? Chris, could you go set up an activity for the innovation workshop tomorrow? No. They realize I got crushed and it's time for me to go home. How often does that happen in emergency medicine? Not that often. I'm not going to get punished every shift I work. In a school setting, it needs to work that way too. How many times do you get a devastating day at school? Depends, but it's
Hmm.
certainly not every day, and I would hope it's rare.
Sure.
But the point being, how many times do teachers at the end of that devastating day stay hours late, maximize everything for the next day? They shouldn't. They dealt with what the world handed them that day. Maybe it
Hmm.
was a colleague who burst into tears because they're getting divorced. Maybe it was a kid who made a suicidal comment, right, that you had to follow up on immediately.
Hmm.
Maybe it was something went wrong in the science lab and a kid unfortunately accidentally got hurt. There are moments in a school setting that are high level triage, and I think teachers have this mindset that they must do all things before they go home that day. No, the school will do all things for kids that day. You just do your part. And I'm not trying to say that teachers should skimp or become, you know, um, lethargic about their job. That's not the case at all. They won't.
Sure.
They're type A. But what I'm trying to say is on those days where you've really been maximized in workflow with high acuity events, you can go home. And the obvious question a teacher is going to say to me is, well, I didn't get my grading done or I didn't set my lab up. Right. We just talked about student mental health, right? What better moment than to walk in the next day and say, spur of the moment, we're changing our lesson plan. You're going to do this. Before you jump into that, I want to tell you why. Let me talk to you about life and the demands that it creates. And you teach, whether that be an elementary level or a high school level, you can have a frank discussion about yesterday I had to make a decision. Maybe you can't go into the details. I couldn't meet all the demands of life. How do you do that when you feel overwhelmed? What do you pick and choose? What do you do? Teach the kids some mental health on the fly, and then say, and that, my friends, is why we're adjusting our lesson plans today. Now, for the rest of the week, I'm going to make it up to you, and here's how.
Okay.
I bet at most you do that once or twice in your academic year, but I bet you that lesson is one kids will never forget. And there was a situation in the high school that I taught at where, although I could not talk about it, most of the kids realized what happened. And I came in and said, hey, we're not doing chem lab today. We're altering this. We're going to do this. I was dealt the following situation yesterday, which I can't discuss. And I talked about how do you reacclimate when emergencies arise? How do you reprioritize your life? How do you shift things? How do you do things? How do you do that in a professional manner? And the kids, while it was a difficult situation that many of them were privy to, were responsible, were eyes glued, were attentive, and realized I was human and liked that I modeled a solution for how do you do things when you're overwhelmed. Another thing teachers can do is leverage their content for mental health gain. And we're going to go into this a little bit, I think, if we
Mhm.
talk about self-esteem and self-efficacy. But I'm going to tell you that, in Canada and the US, we're told what to teach. I'm not asking you to go rogue. By all means, do that. But no
Sure.
one tells you to the depth or how much time or how to do it. Maybe to some extent, some districts have, we'd like it this way. But still, there's a lot of freedom and autonomy in your classroom. And so, what I'm trying to get at is there's never been a moment with student mental health where you are more justified. Those numbers that I shared from CDC, AAP, and some of the numbers that we see in Canada, where no superintendent or parent is going to be upset that you took a moment to connect academic content to, hey, this lab is hard, and here are some things you can set yourself up for success. By the way, let's talk for a second. What are we going to call a good lab result? What if you get this? Is that really a failure? What defines failure? What are we realistically looking for? Come on, you're in middle school. Do you really think you're going to get a percent error or 3%? How are we going to learn? What are the key? You spend time still talking your craft and your subject,
Mhm.
but you're doing what you always wanted to do, connect with kids, and you're justified to do it. Look, the fun part of teaching, and I'm sorry I'm getting animated, but the fun part of teaching is connecting with kids and inspiring them and being there.
That's the
Well,
joy.
that's the joy. And numerically, statistically, whether it be bad or good or both, you have never been more justified to connect with kids. Stop powering through the lesson and have some joy. Take 10 minutes to teach them the life skill. Take 10 minutes to just talk about the realities of failure. Take 10 minutes to mess up a demo on purpose, giggle, and say, this may happen to you today too. Find that joy, because for once in your life, you've never been so justified, from a mental health perspective, to make those kids giggle, to make those
Yeah.
kids see you react, to feel that humanistic part of life and give them a classroom home.
I'm
You know, I
hearing
mean,
I'm hearing you say, "When there's joy, there's so much more connection."
Exactly. Exactly. Um, and then, one thing that I'd also like to talk about, and I'm actually spending time working on this, and hopefully it manifests into a book, but whether it does or not, teachers also always say yes to things, right? Can you do this? Yes. They know they can't. They've got too much on their plate and they add something else. So I'm going to suggest to all those watching today,
Mm.
simple, amazing tool. Draw a pie chart, circular pie chart. Divide it up into time at work, right? And maybe do the week, right? Time I spend at work each week, make that part of your pie chart. It's probably big. Time I spend at home. You are allowed to divide up what you do at work any way you want, but your new rule is you cannot go into what you do at home, right? So when someone comes and talks to you, hey, would you be the senior class sponsor? Then you can look at your pie chart and you can say, usually your admins are on your side. They're usually your friend, right? They don't know what you got going on. Hey,
Mhm.
I'm already doing these three things. If you want to take this one off my plate, I'll be your senior class sponsor. Or usually the response I got was, Chris, didn't know you were doing that. In fact, let me take this one away from you. And no, you're not allowed to be the senior class sponsor. Or with another teacher, I love this, you love that, want to switch. Find a way to negotiate no, because we're all so good hearted. We want to say yes. Use that as a tool. It's a visual graphic. It sounds so simple, right? It sounds so silly. I would walk into meetings and say, this is what I'm doing. My wife made me bring this because she knew I'd say
Mhm.
yes. This is my reminder that if you want me to do it, cool, but you're going to have to trade something out. And you know what? It was a great way to solve issues.
Those are great strategies. I think that's what a lot of teachers are looking for right now, looking for ways to find those ways to connect with our kids, to find that joy, and also thank you so much for the stories. Thank you for letting us know how you did that in the classroom setting. Um, so we do have only a few minutes left in our conversation, which has been so great. I did want to, if it's all right with you, just spend a little bit of time on building student self-esteem and self-efficacy. We know that that's something that a lot of people are hearing about now. It's being talked about in schools a lot right now, but how do you do that every day? How do you build those skills every day in the classroom? Is there anything that you can share with us that would help educators find ways to build self-esteem and self-efficacy?
Sure. I think one of the most realistic ways for educators to deliver some aspect of support to student mental health is preventive. If you look at all the ways you can layer out preventive mental health and then eliminate the ones that should be done by qualified providers, what's left over for teachers? Self-esteem and self-efficacy are two massive protective factors, particularly self-esteem. And we're good at it. We are amazingly good at it in the education community, right? So I'm going to use a story to illustrate the point, and I'll try to keep it
Mhm.
to 3 minutes. When I taught anatomy, there was a situation, and I borrowed this idea from a friend, so I want to give credit where credit's due. And I taught kids about the lung because in my district, I was supposed to teach certain concepts. And once I got
Mm.
through those concepts, I would normally go deeper, right? And then it dawned on me, if a kid goes to nursing school or med school or whatever, they're going to get this deeper content later anyway. And I've already done what I was obligated by the school district. So I thought it'd be fun. I brought in 6 chest x-rays and I taped them around the room. And I said to the kids, I want you to hop up and look at those chest x-rays. There's at least one thing wrong with every one of them. In fact, there's lots of things wrong. You just need to find one.
Mhm.
What was the problem? I never taught the kid how to read chest x-rays, right? It was an unfair task. So they get up and what do? They quietly start walking over to the chest x-rays. No one's talking to each other. They're looking at each other. They're very concerned. And then one friend talks to another in a whisper, do you know what's going on? And the
Mm.
other friend's like, not really. And they kind of would look at it. And then two friends would talk to other two friends. And then they got excited when they noticed the same thing. And then all of a sudden groups formed and groups were cross-checking other groups' answers. Then they come and sit back down. Hey guys, what'd you think of that? Well, Dr. Jenson, it wasn't really fair. You're right. Let me tell you what you did. And I explained the process. And then I said, why did you go by yourself? Well, because I didn't want people to realize that I didn't know a lot about this. Okay. Why did you ask the first person you asked? Who was the first person you asked? Why them? Well, it was my friend and I knew they wouldn't judge me. Oh, okay. When did you decide to go into groups? All of a sudden, we noticed we could hear other people noticing the same things in the chest x-ray that we did. So we thought we'd team up with others. Oh, great. Friends, isn't that a problem solving model for your first job? No matter what you do, when your boss hands you something that you've never
Right.
seen,
That's
you're
right.
going to feel scared and intimidated. Who do you reach out to first? Probably a best friend in the company or a best friend somewhere else who does similar work. Then what do? Then you cross check with other groups. And then you come back to your boss at some point and say, not 100% confident, but here was what I got for you, and here's why.
Mhm.
And the kids kind of laughed and giggled, but I taught them efficacy.
Yeah.
And then I went back and taught them, don't feel sheepish because you didn't know yet. Feel amazed because you found a way to solve this without knowing anything. I had taken science and I connected it with efficacy. It was the joy of teaching. And my kids needed that more than anything I could teach them about the lung.
That's a
So that's
brilliant,
one
brilliant
model.
story. That's brilliant.
Well, you're very kind, but every teacher could create their own version of this
Mm.
as many times as they want in a week. And I think it'd be well received.
Great. So when we're looking at all of these things that we've talked about today, I am going to jump into a couple questions that we received from the audience. I did also want to let you know, those of you watching today, that you will be receiving an email right after the session with a recorded version of today's conversation. You will have 3 days to be able to watch it as many times as you need to. And there's also going to be a survey coming out. You'll see that in your email as well, about what you thought of the session, but also looking forward to other conversations as well in the future. So, Dr. Jenson, we did have a question come in. Again, we are at a point where we will have to wrap up pretty soon. We were going to talk a little bit about behaviors that you might see in the classroom, but coming back to the question that's posed over here, what are some of the strategies that you might consider or offer to support young students in the classroom displaying regular oppositional behaviors, especially when a family may not be ready yet to start that journey seeking assistance from a professional?
Sure. And so let's talk about a couple of things and I'll try to move through them concisely. For behaviors that vary from what you're looking for out of students, educators can take a little bit from some of the psychology we use. So positive reward systems for when the behavior is done right, followed by, and sometimes it's tough, right? Sometimes something's so disruptive that you have to deal with it and maybe even move it out of the classroom. But if it's something that's aberrant but can be managed, ignoring negative behavior, just flat out ignoring to the best of your capacity, while really hammering in positive rewards for when a student does something correct, at all age levels can be highly effective. Other ways to support kids, anxiety, we talked about that. In the elementary age, trying to help a student understand that the reason they had this physical or emotional response is because of a certain thought, helping them tie it to that thought. And then creating a plan for when you have this thought, here's what I want us to do next time. Not so much saying stop having those thoughts, but when you have this again, here's how I will help you, right? Here's how I will work with you. At the high school level, still valuable, you just scale more detail and maybe you add in preventative measures. Here's what you can do when you feel that thought building. If
Mhm.
that does not work, I'm here. Depression, right? Probably the best thing we could do with depression is just recognize the fact that a kid has gone through multiple changes. Treatment of depression can sometimes be very complex, and certainly we're not there to provide that as educators. But realizing that although a kid may be engaged in class, smiling, particularly adolescents, man, are they amazing at trying to hide distraught thoughts. Noticing multiple changes and just going to a counselor or a social worker along those lines is huge to support it. And I think those are a couple of things that I would give as specific examples.
Great. Thank you. We don't have time for any more questions. I just there we did have a comment. If there's time, just is there one suggestion that you might have for an educator to be able to bring a concern to the school itself? So, is there anything at a meeting that a educator could say, or some way to address a concern they have in their classroom?
Sure. I think the best way to do things is to remind yourself of two things. One, what evidence do you bring? So it
Mhm.
doesn't seem like your opinion. So journaling, writing down dates. This is what I've seen. You don't have to be explicit, but I'm noticing this seems to be a pattern over this 8-week period. And the second is a tentative solution,
Okay.
right? And then let it go. You've addressed the potential concern, you've suggested a tentative solution to the best of your skill set, right? A qualified provider may change your solution. That's fine. Just come up with your suggested solution so you feel like you're amicably coming to the table and it's not just someone you don't want to be perceived as complaining, right? I noticed this concern. Here's my tentative suggestion. Would counseling look into it, please? I think that's a great format.
Great. Okay, so we have run out of time. I wish we could keep talking because it's been a fascinating conversation. We really appreciate your suggestions, your advice, your expertise in this area. We look forward to speaking with you again. I want to thank everyone who joined today, and this is a conversation that we need to keep having. So. Please take a look at your emails, those of you who joined today, and the recording will be there for you. Share more information about mental health. We'll keep having this conversation, Dr. Jenson, and really thank you so, so much for taking the time with us today.
Well, that's kind of you. It was an honor and a privilege, and I mean that. And again, I really admire the work that Geneva Center for Autism and Sonderly do, hand in hand. And my heart is with teachers. I went from medicine to teaching, and now I advise on health issues in schools. My heart has always been with teachers, and it always will be.
All right. Well, I wish you a great rest of your summer. And to all of those watching, take a little bit of time for yourselves this summer. And here's to a good new school year. Sending a lot of good wishes for a good year. Take care, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.